Imagine there are two producers, Jim and Jamal. Jim has been producing for 6 months and still uses the default Ableton template. Now, while his music is improving, he constantly feels down at the thought of having to start a new song, and he never knows where to start. On the other hand, Jamal has been producing for 2 years, and his Ableton template is handcrafted to his perfect workflow. He has his default tracks, return channels, and arrangement markers all dialed in, and this encourages him to start and finish more tracks than ever. What's up, it's Aiden from EDMProd, and today I want to help you be more like Jamal and set up your perfect Ableton template. Now, before we dive in, if you do want a more comprehensive guide, a one-stop shop to everything Ableton, make sure to check out our free Ableton workflow Bible, 112 pages of Ableton goodness written by the amazing Connor O'Brien. Down in the description, go check that out. And with that, let's dive in. So very quickly, I just want to show you how you can actually create a template. Now, you may have an existing template, or you may just have the default Ableton one when you first load up a new session of Ableton. I have my default one just loaded up here. What you want to do is you want to first customize the project exactly as you would want it. You don't need to go into a special mode to customize the default template. You just need to currently work with what you've got. So as you can see, I've set up mine with all of my channels and everything here, stuff on the master. Once you've done that, you want to go up to File, and you want to save live set as default set. Just a quick mention as well, you can save as a template, which is different to your default set. Doing so will save it in the templates folder here in Ableton that you can load up at any time, but it won't be your default set. If you do want to change it at any point though, you can right click on any template in this folder and set default live set. Whichever way you do it, once you've set your default set, that will be the next thing that loads up exactly as you left it when you hit Ableton. So now that we know how to set up a default set, let's dive into a few principles that'll help us get the perfect template for what we need to do. Now, the first principle here is less is more. And what you're really wanting to do here is balance your creative options, what you can do, with limitations, what forces you in a certain direction with your music. Now, this is an overarching principle for the other 5 principles that I'm going to be covering in this video as well. And really, it's all about having less distraction, less options, less CPU usage, which is hugely overrated, and also less creative pigeonholing. So basically, you can see here at a glance my template that I use. Now, it's very simple. It's inspiring because I'm not weighed down with too many options. I have the tracks that I need loaded up, which is what I'm going to get to in the next principle. And it's just generally speaking, following the principle of less is more, right? I don't have like 10 instances of Serum. The amount of plugins that are on each channel are minimal, right? I'm using minimal processing even on my returns. Again, something I'll get to. A few key deliberate things on my master channel. It's very simple. For you, this might be too complicated and maybe you need to strip it back even more. Or for you, you might want a few more things, but whatever simple is to you, make sure you keep it at that level and do no more. Now, this leads me to number 2, which is to use only the default channels that you actually use in every single song. Now, note here that I haven't said any song, I said every song. If your songs always have a kick drum, always have a snare, always have a hi-hat, always have some sort of bass line, make sure those channels, whether it's in audio or MIDI, and for most part, I personally use audio, although there's a few MIDI channels here as well, are existent and ready to use each time. Now, I don't recommend having channels that you might use. It could clog out your project and just cause distraction when you know there are already things that are those core ingredients that are going to sit there every time. For example, maybe in a certain track, I like to use a few mid-bass sounds to fill out the mid-range of my track, but I don't do that in every track. I wouldn't put those channels in my default template because it's just going to be another one there. And I don't necessarily need it depending on the song I'm working for. And it's very easy for me to add 1 or 2 extra channels here and there than it is to think about having to delete a bunch of extra ones every time I go to make music, if that makes sense. So have your bare minimum tracks, the ones you use in every single track you're working on, and you'll thank yourself later down the track. As mentioned, for me, this is a kick, a snare, a hi-hat, which is pretty much ubiquitous in all electronic genres. I have a break layer. I make drum and bass, so I like to bring in some acoustic kind of sample break beats. I have a sub bass that I use in every single track. I always like to try and add some sort of vocal sample or recorded sample, and this is also set to my input channel so I can record that. I like to sometimes start my song with either a sample or an instrument, so I have 2 channels set up for that, which I'll get to a bit later in this video. And then I have a few effects channels that effects are going into pretty much every track I make, so it only makes sense to have them there. Awesome thing about these is that they also serve as creative triggers. If I forget something that might be missing from my track that I know I'm really wanting, I can go ahead and look at what I've got in my default template and be like, this song is missing a crash cymbal. Boom, put one in. Really easy. And like you can see here, I've actually color coded them by type. So all my drums are pink, my bass is green, vocal purple, instruments blue, and effects white. So that just really helps me understand where I am in my project vertically, and then I can make good creative decisions. So number 3 is to opt for rack presets instead of loading up your template with heaps of plugins. As I mentioned, you'll notice a lot of my tracks here don't have a lot. I have a utility and an EQ on every track because I know pretty much every track is going to have one of those things on there because they're so basic in my mixdown workflow. However, you'll even notice some of them are using EQ8 instead of my preferred EQ, which is Pro Q3, one of the only third-party plugins that I use religiously. And the reason for this is, again, saving CPU usage. But apart from that, of course, I'm using more third-party plugins. And again, of course, I'm using the same signal chain, the same set of plugins on certain devices, on certain instruments often. But I don't put them in my template for a good reason. CPU. One, it's going to take the project a lot longer to load up, which is just another layer between me getting in the door and making music that I want to. So I don't like to put too much in there for that reason. And also, it can just be too early in your workflow to have those plugins there, and it can actually kind of stifle your creativity. I have a few plugins obviously on my returns here, and the bulk of my existing plugins are on my master because I know these are low CPU analysis plugins. They're not doing a lot of processing. I have a reference track plugin, which again is a great thing to have, which I'll get to at the end. A limiter is one of the only actual processing units I have on here. And a few other minor things, for example, a mid-side solo rack and stuff that, again, I'm using every single time. But I don't have any buses. I don't have any super complex mastering chains. Literally, for mastering, it's just a limiter which I can turn on and off with my keyboard shortcuts, right? So that's what I do. I don't keep it complicated. Instead, I have my audio effect rack folder saved down here, which you can also access via the user library up here. But I prefer just having the shortcut down here. And I have, for example, a bus folder, a mastering folder, and a return folder. So I can actually bring on, say I want to, at a later point, group my drums together and bring on a drums bus. I'll put on the drums bus processing chain, and boom, once it loads up, you can see this is why I don't keep it in my template. All my favorite drums bus devices are ready to go. And this is the best of both worlds because you still have the time saved from not making this from scratch every time, but it's not bogging your template down. This also goes for instrument racks where you've got presets. This can be with all of your Ableton post-processing on. So say some of these even have like a little bit of Serum and maybe some post-processing there, or maybe even just Serum in some cases. Whatever it is, I save instrument racks to. This one, for example, has an operator patch. Now, if you do want to put together a rack, say you have an instrument, maybe an analog with a little bit of EQ, with a high pass filter, and maybe some echo or something like that. You can shift click all the devices, Command G to put them into a group, and then down the bottom here, there's this save icon in the bottom left. Click that, and you can name it whatever the heck you want. New lead 2.0. That's how you do it. So number 4 here is to create 1 to 3 starting points. Imagine you're in a traditional musical recording studio. You're probably going to have a few instrument stations set up around the room that you can go to in order to start jamming out a song idea on. We want to recreate that environment in our DAW. Now, I personally don't like to do this too much because I've used it in the past and for me it personally doesn't work, but it may work well for you. Basically what I'm talking about here is having a few key deliberate sounds, again, ones you use in pretty much every track or every track, loaded up by default. Again, not every sound is loaded up, but maybe just the piano that you always use. You could go ahead here and bring in a piano sound, you know? Or maybe for you, you like to work in drum racks. So you have your drums all on a rack, you have a drum rack loaded up, and then once it's loaded up, you can start to bring on your kick sample and your snare etc. And this could be with bass, it could be with leads, chords, whatever sounds you use regularly, you can put just those bare minimum sounds in your project, preferably something that is a strength for you as a producer, because it's going to encourage you to start putting paint on the canvas, right? If you're really good at drum programming, having your drums loaded up by default will get you in the flow because you're immediately going to feel compelled to jump in and start making a new drum pattern. Now, again, don't overdo this because it can increase your CPU usage. So be very deliberate with which instruments and which sounds you do have there. Some people like to even have kicks in audio loaded up by default just so they can start vibing with, say, a piano to that, but I don't personally do that. Okay, so number 5 is to set up return tracks to save CPU. Now, return tracks are great because, again, they actually form a huge part of your sound, but they just save you time and resources. I have a few set up here, and again, they're cool to set up because they're just simply one and done. You do it once, you don't have to overthink it, and then you're not even looking at the reverb. You're just simply using these little send faders on each channel throughout your project. The cool thing with sends as well is you can shape, say, a reverb or a compressor or whatever effect you've got on the send with additional plugins so that you can shape maybe the EQ spectrum, or maybe you want to add compression to your reverb, or you want to add multiple layers of reverb on the one channel. You can do that with returns, and it's very, very cool. My example here is I have drum verbs. So for example, if I find a quick drum loop, let's chuck this one in and loop it up. On my drums group here, I can start to send my drum break there. Blend it to taste, and immediately I've got some reverb on my drums. I've set this preset up exactly as I like it. It's got a nice bit of brightness and it works for my sound. I also have a main verb with Valhalla Vintage Verb, which is a bit more of a thicker, longer, chorusy reverb for main instruments and stuff like that. I have a high pass bass verb, which is not muddy and has the lows taken out of it, so it works if I want to add a bit of clean space to my bass sounds. And lastly, I have a stereo bus set up with Ozone Imager, just with the side channel soloed, so that I can add a bit of stereo image to any of my instruments in the mix. This is how I personally like to control my stereo image. Some people might do it at the mastering stage, but this is what I like to do. Now, this is just how I use it. You could go ahead and add more or have less. For example, some people like to have a parallel saturation rack. Maybe some people like to have a parallel compression rack to kind of give your mix a bit more fullness. I tend to do these things on my buses instead. Some people, like the Ableton default template, has a nice delay. You can go ahead and do exactly what works for you and what you know you're going to end up using in pretty much any track. Okay, so number 6 is to actually go ahead and set up arrangement markers, or what are called dummy clips. Now, normally this is actually paired with the idea of using a reference track. Now, I personally don't put a reference track in my default template because, again, it will pigeonhole me too much. I like to choose my reference track for each song I work on. However, you can have a track here and just call it reference. Set it to go to the external out so it doesn't have any master processing applied to the track you're referencing. Again, because a lot of reference tracks will already have mastering chains on them. And I can actually use that as a reference track, not only for the mix down and for the sonic qualities that I want to imbue onto my track, but also to map out my arrangement and structure. I have a default structure set up here in mind with intro, build, drop, few sections of the drop there, breakdown, build, drop 2, A, B, and C, and then an outro. This is a drum and bass structure that I kind of use. The good thing is that it's flexible. I can go ahead and move things around. I can also use Command I to insert more time and say I wanted to extend the intro out. I can do that. I can Shift Command delete time. I could also Shift Command D duplicate time, so I could make the build twice as long there, add an extra drop section there, etc. Now, I do this with dummy MIDI clips in this case. Basically, you just want to create a new MIDI channel. I've called mine structure, and you can just go ahead and select in, say, 8 or 16 bar segments, a section that you would like to add. Maybe I want to add a like outro 2 section. Let's say, why not 2 outros? I've selected 16 bars here and just pressed Shift Command M to create a new MIDI clip that's blank. You don't have to put any notes in there, obviously, because there's no sound or instruments loaded up. And this is just more of a signifier to show you that you've got this part of your track as a section. I like to leave my structure track at the top, and I can just kind of build my rest of my track underneath each of these markers. Now, also, the way that Ableton has designed you want to do this, which I used to use, but I'm starting to move away from now, is to right-click and add a locator on the arrangement. And this is the same sort of thing, except it just creates these playheads that you can basically see visually that exist. Now, you can see the difference here. The one benefit of the markers at the top here is it's a little more visually out of the way, but it can be a bit intrusive as well. These lines kind of stick through the whole arrangement. So if you don't like that, it's a bit annoying. But, you know, the downside with this structure is it's not really designed to be, you know, MIDI clips aren't designed to be used to structure things. So, for example, it can just be a bit annoying if you're adding new tracks in and then you're moving stuff around. This structure will get moved around as you move audio and MIDI tracks around. And you can't, unfortunately, really pin a track. It's just kind of wherever you place it. So it's not designed to be used like that, but it absolutely can be used like that if you like. Now, it's worth mentioning that when you set up a arrangement marker situation like this, or however you do it, you don't want to pigeonhole yourself too much. I'd strongly encourage that you use this as a starting point and then use those tools like duplicating time and stuff to customize your arrangement to each song that you're working on, each reference track you may be using, or just what you feel creatively you want to do. It's also worth mentioning, of course, that you want to set your tempo in your template to the tempo of the genre or style that you generally tend to make. Now, if you make multiple genres, you can create different templates or just customize it each time. But whatever you tend towards most, set it up, because again, it's one less thing you've got to worry about setting up in your template each time. And it's going to make adding your structure, adding a reference track a lot easier. All of this stuff are aimed at helping you make music better, faster, and more creative. So your template should ultimately be helping you do that. And all of this being said, your template is constantly evolving. Sometimes I've had more complicated setups and sometimes more simple. Right now, I'm somewhere in between. Either way, you'll just need to adjust to your circumstances and where you're feeling creatively. But for now, if you followed along with all these principles and tips, you'll have a template that you're proud of, that you feel inspired by, and hopefully that encourages you to get in the door and make some more music. Trust you enjoy this one. Remember to grab the free Ableton Workflow Bible down below in the description, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.